The first thing folks heard that morning was the whistle of the northbound train cutting through the cold dawn air, long and lonely, like it already knew somebody was about to lose something they could never get back. And in the dusty town of Red Hollow, that whistle meant change, and change meant trouble. And standing on the edge of it all was Clara May Whitfield, with a single leather valise in her trembling hand, her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin, eyes fixed on the thin silver line of rail that promised distance. And she told herself she would not look back. Not once. Not for him. Not for the ranch house on the hill. Not for the man whose shadow had followed her heart longer than she cared to admit. Clara had risen before the rooster crowed, moving quiet as a cat through the small boarding room she had rented above the Mercantile, folding her dresses careful and slow, pausing only once when her fingers brushed the blue ribbon he had given her at the county fair. The night lanterns swung overhead, and laughter rolled across the dance floor like summer thunder. She almost left the ribbon behind, almost. But in the end, she tucked it into her bag because leaving without goodbye was already hard. Enough without pretending the past had not been real. Down at the livery stable on the edge of town, a black stallion named Midnight pawed the dirt with restless fury, steam rising from his flared nostrils in the cool morning air, and the stable boy swore the animal had been unsettled all night, pacing and snorting, as if some unseen hand tugged at his reins from miles away. And if horses could sense heartbreak, then Midnight knew more than any preacher in Red Hollow, because he belonged to James Callahan, and James had not slept a wink since Clara's eyes had turned distant 3 days ago. James stood on the porch of the Callahan ranch house, watching the horizon pale from indigo to gold, coffee gone cold in his grip, jaw set hard beneath a day's worth of stubble. He had felt it coming, the way a man feels a storm before it breaks. Clara had been smiling less, speaking softer, standing farther away, and he had been too stubborn, too proud, to ask what troubled her, because cowboys were taught to mend fences and ride out blizzards, not to beg a woman to stay. And now the silence between them had grown so wide it could swallow a lifetime. Word travels quick in a small town, quicker than a prairie fire when the wind is right. And by sunrise, Mrs. Davenport from the bakery had whispered to the barber that Clara May was leaving on the 7 o'clock train, and the barber had muttered it to the postman, and before long half the town knew she would be gone by breakfast. But no one carried that news up the long dirt road to the Callahan ranch, perhaps because folks believed what was meant to be would find its own way, or perhaps because they feared stepping between a man and his regrets. Clara reached the station just as the conductor stepped down to check his watch, the platform nearly empty save for a traveling salesman and a soldier heading east. She kept her chin high, though her stomach twisted like barbed wire. The ticket agent tipped his hat and asked if she was certain about Chicago, and she answered yes, with a voice steadier than she felt, because beyond Red Hollow lay opportunity, a teaching position waiting in a city that did not know her name or her heart, and she believed distance would dull the ache of loving a man who could not say the words she needed to hear back at the ranch. A ranch hand named Eli finally broke his silence, shifting his weight from boot to boot before clearing his throat and telling James he had seen Clara walking toward town with that valise. And it was as if the world narrowed to a single point of sound, the ticking of the old clock inside the house, the rush of blood in James's ears, and without a word he set down his cup, grabbed his hat, and strode toward the stable, pride forgotten in the wake of something far more powerful, fear, not of losing a woman, but of losing the only woman who had ever made that wide, lonely land feel like home. Midnight did not need urging. The moment James swung into the saddle, the stallion surged forward, as if chasing destiny itself, hooves striking sparks from stone, dust rising in wild spirals behind them, the wind tearing at James's coat, while the station whistle blew again in the distance, sharper now, closer to departure, and Clara stood at the edge of the platform clutching her ticket as the train began to roll. Slow at first, wheels grinding against steel, and just as she took her first step toward the open carriage door, a thunder of hoofs shattered the morning calm, and every head turned as Midnight burst through the station yard, black as midnight sign, faster than the train gathering speed, faster than doubt, faster than goodbye, and Clara's breath caught in her throat because she knew that horse, she knew that rider, and she knew that whatever happened next would change the course of both their lives forever. The train gathered speed like a steel serpent stretching awake, smoke billowing thick against the pale sky, wheels grinding and clattering, as if daring any man alive to outrun it. And yet James Callahan leaned low over Midnight's neck with a fire in his eyes that no machine could measure, the wind slicing tears from the corners of his eyes while the platform erupted in startled cries. Clara frozen halfway to the carriage steps, skirts whipping about her ankles, her heart pounding louder than the engine's roar, because she had meant to leave quiet and unseen, not chased by thunder and dust and the man she had loved in silence. Midnight's hooves struck the packed earth beside the tracks, finding rhythm against the pounding rails, and James felt the stallion's strength coil and release beneath him like a living storm. He did not call Clara's name at first, pride still wrestling in his chest with desperation. But when the train lurched faster and the conductor shouted for passengers to board, the words tore free from him raw and unpolished. "Clara May," he bellowed, voice breaking across the open land, and she turned, truly turned this time, eyes wide and shining, seeing not the rancher bound by silence but the man stripped bare by fear of losing her. The conductor reached for her valise, urging her forward, warning that the train would not wait for romance or regret. But Clara's boots refused to move, because there was something in James's voice she had never heard before. Not command, not stubbornness, but pleading. And she remembered every evening spent on the Callahan porch watching sunsets bleed into gold. Remembered the way he had fixed the schoolhouse roof without being asked. Remembered how his hand had trembled the night he tied that blue ribbon round her wrist at the fair. As if he were handling something precious and breakable, James pressed Midnight harder. The stallion surging alongside the moving train now, iron wheels and pounding hooves racing neck and neck, sparks flying where steel met steel, townsfolk scattering from the edge of the tracks as dust swallowed the morning light. And for one wild heartbeat it seemed the horse might truly outrun the engine. Might shame progress itself, but speed was not James's only battle. He was racing against years of unspoken words, against every time he had swallowed feeling in favor of pride, and the weight of that silence bore down heavier than any saddle. Clara stepped away from the carriage, just as the train gained another breath of speed, the conductor cursing beneath his mustache while grabbing for the railing, and she moved toward the edge of the platform, skirts brushing the dirt, her gaze locked on James as he drew even with her position. Midnight straining yet steady, and she saw it plain as day, the fear in his jaw, the apology in his eyes, and she called out to him across the widening stretch of noise, "You had your chance." Though her voice trembled like a prayer she was not certain would be answered, James guided Midnight closer to the platform edge, where the ground dipped dangerously near the tracks, risking bone and blood for the sake of a single moment, and he reached one gloved hand toward her though yards still separated them. "I was a fool," he shouted over the thunder of iron. Each word wrestled from his chest. "I thought loving you meant holding steady and silent. I thought you knew," and Clara felt those words strike deeper than any letter could have, because she had never doubted his care, only his courage to name it. The train surged past them, now too fast for boarding, too fast for hesitation, its last carriage rattling like distant thunder as it disappeared down the line toward a future Clara had almost claimed, and silence fell heavy in its wake, broken only by Midnight's labored breathing and the murmur of stunned townsfolk. James drew the stallion to a halt near the platform, chest heaving, hat lost somewhere along the chase, hair wild with wind, and in that stillness he looked smaller somehow, not the broad-shouldered rancher who commanded cattle drives, but a man waiting to learn if his heart had arrived too late. Clara stood a few paces from him, ticket crumpled in her fist, the paper softening with the sweat of indecision, and she could have scolded him, could have turned away and demanded he ride back to his land and his pride. Yet when she stepped closer she saw the truth laid bare across his face, and she realized he had not raced the train to win a spectacle. He had raced it because he feared waking tomorrow to a horizon without her in it. And though the train was gone and Chicago miles away, the real journey now stood between them on that dusty stretch of earth, waiting for one of them to speak the final word that would decide whether this was an ending or a beginning. The dust settled slow as falling snow, drifting back to earth as though the land itself held its breath, and James Callahan slid from Midnight's back with legs unsteady from more than the ride, boots striking the ground in a dull thud that seemed louder than the train had been. He stood there a moment, hatless wind tugging at his shirt, unsure whether to step forward or remain where he was, because courage in the saddle had come easier than courage on his feet. And Clara May Whitfield watched him with eyes no longer wild but searching, As if weighing the worth of a man against the promise of a faraway city, the townsfolk lingered at a respectful distance, whispers passing between them like cautious birds, yet none dared interrupt what was unfolding. For even in Red Hollow, where gossip bloomed faster than spring wildflowers, there was an understanding that some reckonings belonged only to the souls standing in their midst, and Clara let the crumpled ticket fall from her fingers, not in surrender but in acknowledgement that paper and ink had never truly held her future. It had always been tied to choice, and choice now stood before her, breathing hard and waiting. James took a step closer, then another, boots grinding softly against gravel. "I won't beg," he began, voice rough as unplaned timber, then stopped himself and shook his head, because pride had nearly cost him everything once already. "No, that ain't the truth," he corrected, swallowing hard. "I will beg if I must, but not for your pity, Clara, only for the chance to do better than I have." And the honesty in those words rang clearer than any grand speech, because they were stripped of swagger and built instead on humility. Clara drew in a long breath that tasted of coal smoke and sun-warmed dust, and she remembered the teaching post waiting in Chicago, the classroom of eager faces she had imagined, the independence she had sworn to claim. Yet she also remembered the evenings on the Callahan porch, the quiet strength in James's presence, the way he had once ridden through a storm to fetch medicine for Mrs. Davenport without asking payment or praise. And she realized she had never been running from small-town life. She had been running from the ache of loving a man who did not know how to speak his heart. Midnight lowered his proud head, as if sensing the shift in air, the stallion's sides rising and falling in steady rhythm, and James reached to stroke the horse's neck, grounding himself in something familiar before lifting his gaze to Clara once more. "I don't know city ways," he admitted, "and I may never learn them, but I can learn you better than I have. I can say what I feel before silence grows between us again," and the simplicity of that vow carried more weight than polished poetry ever could. Clara stepped forward until only an arm's length separated them, her bonnet loosened by the wind, hair slipping free in soft curls around her face, and she searched his eyes for any trace of hesitation, finding none, only earnest resolve. "I was afraid," she confessed, voice gentler now, "afraid that if I stayed, I would always wonder whether you loved me enough to fight for me." And her gaze flickered briefly toward the empty tracks stretching east. "But you rode against a train this morning, James. That counts for something." A faint smile touching her lips, despite herself, a murmur of relieved laughter rippled through the onlookers, tension easing like a tightened rope finally cut, and James dared to close the distance, his hands hovering at her waist, as if asking silent permission before settling there, careful and reverent. "I reckon it counts for everything," he replied. And in that dusty station yard, beneath a sky turning bright with full morning light, he bent his forehead to hers, not in possession but in partnership, as though sealing not just affection but understanding. The kind built from mistakes faced and mended the tracks lay quiet once more, stretching toward horizons neither of them needed to chase that day, and Clara glanced back only once, not with longing but with gratitude for the courage that had carried her this far. Then she turned fully toward James and the waiting ranch beyond town, where fences still needed mending and sunsets still burned gold across open fields. And as midnight stamped impatiently as if ready for a gentler ride home, Clara took James's offered hand, and together they walked away from the station, not because the world was small, but because they had chosen to build something larger within it, a promise written not on paper bound for distant cities, but in dust and devotion beneath the wide western sky.